Good morning, good morning, good morning, beautiful people. Good afternoon, good evening. No matter what time it is, just know this is the day that the Lord has made, and I will rejoice and be glad in it. As always, God is good, and He is good all the time. If the tale of Ellen Grice's rape represented one of the most vivid fantasies of Southern whites, this new rumor was fueled by another. The vision of crazed black men rising up and taking vengeance on their former masters. Desperate conclusion. Having dared to defend themselves against the mob, they now faced the prospect of either being lynched once they were captured or legally hung when they were tried by an all-white jury that was likely to include friends and relatives of the men they had shot. As they peered through the leaves and saw a posse approaching, they decided it was better to be killed in a gunfight than surrender to the kind of white men who regularly tortured, shot, castrated, and burned African Americans alive, often for far less than what these men had already done. All right, y'all. So I'm over here eating a PBJ sandwich. But we about to motherfucking read a book, all right? We about to read. It's called BAM! Blood at the Root, A Racial Cleansing in America. Sorry. By Patrick Phillips. I'm always telling people to motherfucking read a book. I always recommend, and I don't be thinking people be reading these books, and I think these books be good, you know what I'm saying? So I decided I'm gonna start motherfucking a segment of my YouTube channel where I just read to y'all. So we're gonna start with this book, and we're gonna read just a chapter, all right? So let go. Let me eat my sandwich first. Gotta flush it down with some water. I know some people prefer milk, but I'm going to the gym. Gotta stay hydrated. The first chapter is called The Scream. On Thursday, September 5th, 1912, Ellen Grice let out a terrifying scream. Some says this occurred at the house of her parents, Joseph and Luna Brooks. Others that Grice was at her own home when her husband, a young farmer named John Grice, came in about midnight and found his wife and at once sounded an alarm. A century later, there is no way to know exactly what led to her cry for help, who first heard it, or what transpired in the minutes after. But soon newspaper all over the South were telling readers what Ellen Grice said then, that she had been awakened by the presence of a Negro man in her bed. When they heard Grice's story of a black rapist forcing his way through an open window, the white men of Forsyth County didn't waste time asking a lot of questions. By the next morning, the news had spread from house to house, country store to country store, and all of white Forsyth was in an uproar. When word reached the county seat of Cumming, a team of bloodhounds was assembled and a posse of white men were deputized on the spot. Now, for those who don't know what deputizing is when you temporarily make someone a police officer in the sense of you give them some temporary police duties. Now, at this time, the only people that were deputized was white men. So, as they saddled their horses and rode off in search of Grice's attacker, they were led by a man who played a central role in the bloody race troubles to come, Sheriff William Reed. Bill Reed turned 50 in 1912 and was in the middle of his second term as sheriff of Forsyth. The job had brought a major improvement in his family's fortunes, and a portrait was taken around the time of his elections to show how quickly Reed transformed himself into one of Cumming's most leading citizens. He went from white trash to motherfucking Cumming's prestige. He went from trailer park to police officer, redneck to high status. As they posed in a photographer's studio, Reed's young sons wore a double-breasted suit, silk ties, and his wife Martha is dressed in fashionable satin, and Reed himself with his dapper tie pin and pomaded hair, his coat thrown open to reveal a gold motherfucking watch chain, looks anything but a hayseed just in from the fields. Look at this dapper motherfucking family. I mean, that's what they consider dapper, you know what I'm saying? But that's precisely what he been when he took office in 1906, having grown up on his father's farm, where the Reeds raised corn, hogs, and struggled through the lean years like everyone else, working the tough red clay of the Georgia motherfucking foothills. Having quickly made a name for himself in town, Reed wore his badge and revolver with a certain amount of swagger and was in no hurry to return to his family farm. And while contemporary newspaper accounts make it clear that he was the face of the law in Forsyth, Reed's name also appears in an obscure but less significant document from those days. A yellowed sheet of onion skin that a secretary fed into the plaiting of her underwood in the 1920s. Across the top she typed, Knights of the Sawney Clavern of the Ku Klux Klan. That nigga was a part of the KKK. Below, among the names of 100 charter members, is Forsyth County Sheriff William W. Reed. Reed's chief rival in the 1912 election had been his own deputy, Mitchell Gay Loomis, a leaner, younger man at 34. He was the grandson of a Confederate hero, war hero, named Andrew Jackson Loomis. The farm in Vickery's Creek where Loomis grew up was surrounded not only by white neighbors, but also by a number of well-established black farmers, including Jasper Gober, Archibald Knuckles, and Isaac Allen. By the summer of 1912, Loomis, too, had set his sights on the job of county sheriff. He was undoubtedly looking to move up in the world, like Reed, but Loomis also needed the money. See, his wife Savannah had died of meningitis in 1909, and he had no choice but to hire a live-in nanny to help raise his 3 young and suddenly motherless daughters, Lily, who's 11, Jewel 8, and Grace 3. A hopeful Loomis declared his candidacy in May of 1912, but lost to Reed that July. And so it was the stout and garrulous Bill Reed, not tall, quiet, Gay Loomis, who sat in the sheriff's office in the early hours of Friday, September 6th, listening to the tale of Ellen Grice's outrage at the hands of a black rapist. By mid-morning, Reed and his posse had ridden 8 miles south of Cumming and arrived at a cluster of tenant farms near Ellen Grice's house, when a group of young boys tore down the road, yelling that the sheriff was coming with a pack of bloodhounds, the black field hands, and sharecroppers of Big Creek knew enough to get out of sight. Loomis was second in command, and so it fell to him to dismount and pound on doors, demanding that one family after another come out into the yard and speak with the sheriff. By sunrise on Saturday, September 7th, Reed and Loomis had arrested and jailed a teenager named Tony Howell, along with 4 other men held as accomplices: Isaiah Perkle, Joe Rogers, Fate Chester, and Johnny Bates. Howell was the nephew of 2 of Cumming's most respected black residents, Morgan and Harriet Strickland, and was staying on the farm they owned in Big Creek to provide some much needed help during the fall harvest. What the other prisoners had in common was that they were unmarried, illiterate black men who happened to live near the scene of the dastardly assault. The Macon Telegraph hinted at the arbitrary nature of their arrests when a reporter wrote that the posse had ridden out to Big Creek and rounded up suspects. Tony Howell also stood out for having been raised not in Forsyth, but in Milton County. Much like Emmett Till in Money, Mississippi 43 years later, this made him conspicuous as the stranger in the group and one of the few black faces in Big Creek known to Reed and Loomis. The Atlanta Georgian would later admit that the evidence against Howell was entirely circumstantial, and in 1912, the very definitions of words like assault and rape They were kept deliberately vague and used to describe almost any incident involving a black man and a white woman. This means that once Tony Howell stood accused of having entered Ellen Grice's bedroom, he was widely regarded as being guilty of some kind of sexual assault, whether or not he had actually been there or whether or not he actually touched Grice. If a lynching takes place, says one journalist, Tony Howell will probably be the victim. In the Jim Crow South, this was the kind of reporting that functioned not just as a prediction, but as a directive to potential lynchers. Man, by lunchtime that Saturday, the town of Cumming was bustling with families from outlying sections making their weekly trip to market. With Howell and 4 other black men locked in the Forsyth County Jail, talks of Ellen Grice was on everyone's lips, but no excitement prevailed. According to the Georgian, until Grice's father, Joseph Brooks, arrived in town bringing word that his daughter was in critical condition from the alleged attack out in Big Creek. This news had an electrifying effect on the crowd, and soon as a group of whites gathered around the little brick jailhouse on Maple Street and demanded that the prisoners be barred out. As more and more people arrived at the square, the town buzzed with what one reporter called a determined spirit of vengeance. Picking his way through the crowd, the Reverend Grant Smith must have looked like any other hired man in Forsyth. At 48, he was a part of the county's poor black underclass, a group that, though they were represented 10% of the total population, were almost totally disenfranchised by the Jim Crow laws of Georgia. While emancipated slaves had been guaranteed the right to vote by the 15th Amendment in 1870, the Georgia legislature countered by adopting the nation's first cumulative poll tax in 1877, then established one of the first white primary systems in 1898. The result? In a place where the vast majority of African Americans could not afford the poll tax, and where Democratic primary winners were almost without fail elected to office, was that men like Grant Smith had no chance of representation in the local government and virtually no power to resist the will of the white majority. Now, for those who don't know, at this time, the Democratic Party resembles what looks like modern day Republicans. Smith earned his living picking corn and cotton in the rolling terrace fields of the county, and it's likely that on the morning of the assignment, he was helping bring in employers harvested crops to market. But to black churchgoers, he was also known as a preacher, and as the son of Reverend Silas Smith, one of the area's leading clergymen whose ornate signature had graced the bottom of college marriage certificates during Reconstruction. Silas and Joanna Smith's oldest son, Grant, had been conceived in the chaotic year of 1863 and was part of the very last generation of African Americans born into slavery. Though he was too young to remember it, Grant was the only one of his 9 siblings who began life as the legal property of a white man. But having been born on the eve of the emancipation also meant that Smith's earliest memories, including going to one of the freedmen's schools that sprang up all over Georgia after the Civil War, when Northern aid societies and the federal government succeeded in establishing a right to education for Georgia's former slaves. As a result, unlike his younger brothers and sisters who came of age after the end of Congressional Reconstruction, and after the colored school system was dismantled in the North Georgia, Smith could read and write. There was no outward sign of it as he shouldered his way past farmers, tradesmen, and merchants hawking their wares on the Cumming Square, but during that brief window of hope in the early 1870s, Grant Smith had become something white Georgians feared almost as much as a black rapist. And that's an outspoken, educated black man. When he learned that Morgan Strickland's nephew, Tony, had been accused of rape and heard white men all around him whipping themselves up into a lynch mob, at some point, Reverend Smith turned to someone in the crowd and said exactly what he thought. It was a shame, he said, that so much trouble was being caused on the account of a sorry white woman. The words were barely out of Smith's mouth before white men all around him froze mid-sentence, stared at each other in disbelief, then tightened their fists around the buggy whips and leather crops with which they'd driven in town. Unable to reach the prisoners inside the jail and outraged by the alleged attack on Grice, they now saw a target much closer to hand. The book-smart, headstrong, uppity black preacher who had dared to question a white woman's worth. News of what he had said spread, according to one witness, like a flash. The infuriated mob was upon him. The first crack of leather brought people from every direction, eager to push their way into the ring of men surrounding Smith, who was now being whipped, kicked, and punched by every fist that could reach him. Estimates put the size of the mob at 300, and those on the outskirts could barely hear Smith grunt and cries over the cheering and shouting. When one group of sweat-soaked men tired, they gave way to others who moved in and took their turn. Witnesses said the preacher was beating nearly to death, that others started gathering scraps of wood from a bonfire on which they planned to burn Grant Smith alive. Before they could, Sheriff Reed and Deputy Loomis muscled their way through the crowd and somehow managed to wrest Smith away. They carried him to the courthouse, where he was at first locked inside a huge basement vault, not so much to keep him in as to keep potential lynchers out. After hearing Smith's moans, Reed finally agreed to move the prisoner upstairs, where a doctor was summoned to treat and dress his wounds. It was around this time, as the bloody, half-naked body of the preacher was carried past his officer door, and as a crowd of hundreds bellowed for Smith to be handed over, that Mayor Charlie Harris realized he needed help. If he wanted to save Grant Smith and the 5 black men in the coming jail from a lynch party that was growing larger and more determined by the minute, Harris knew he would need more than a skinny deputy like Gay Loomis and a glad-handing, good old boy sheriff like Bill Reed. Rising from his chair, Cummings Mayor tapped the little brass lever of a telephone on his desk and told the operator to commandeer all outside lines for an urgent call to Governor Joseph Mackey Brown in Atlanta. As Harris pressed the receiver to his ear and waited, Sheriff Reed stood nearby, scanning the faces in the mob and finding among them, no doubt, a great many men who would soon join him in the Sawney cavern of the Ku Klux Klan. At 39, Mayor Charlie Harris was in the midst of his own climb up the social ladder. Like Reed, he was the son of a dirt farmer, but Harris had gone from plowing his father's fields as a teenager to enrolling at North Georgia Agricultural College in the mid-1890s. After college, Harris distinguished himself as a law student at the University of Georgia, and he seems to have had made some valuable friends there, for in March of 1908, his name was added to a corporate charter issued by the state of Georgia, granting Harris and his partners the right to build a new railroad, the Atlanta Northeastern, which was to run due north from the state capital and terminate in the little town of Cumming. The plan could hardly have been more ambitious and potentially lucrative, given that the hill country of Forsyth had proved remarkably resistant to development after the Civil War, even as nearby cities like Gainesville grew, helped by their location along the Chattahoochee River. Cumming, by contrast, was far too west to use the river for transport and had been bypassed by the Southern Railway, which followed the river valley, and by the Atlanta Knoxville in northern, which passed through Canton to the west. County leaders had been courting railroad entrepreneurs since the earliest days of the Gilded Age. And in 1871, a group of citizens had convened a mass meeting and appointed a committee to try to persuade the Southern Railway to open a station in Cumming. But while locals predicted the stupendous results in adding to our county wealth and population, the board of the railroad remained unconvinced. In 1872, the same committee made a public pledge to tender right of way to the first company that would build a road through the county. And 20 years later, in 1891, Forsyth was still struggling to convince the Richmond and Danville Railroad that Cumming was the ideal terminus for a new branch. Local businessmen had grown so desperate that they offered to donate to the company the sum of $20,000. The recurrence of such a pledge across a 50-year span attests to the aching desire many residents felt for a rail link and their frustration as one company after another bypassed Forsyth. All of this means that when he hung out his shingle on the Cummings Square, Charles L. Harris, Esquire, arrived with a rare combination of talents. He was an ambitious young lawyer and entrepreneur, yet had the common touch of a local farm boy made good. And during his time in law school, he had made some connections with powerful men in Atlanta who could finally put Cumming on the transportation map of the South. Plans for the Atlanta Northeastern received final approval in 1908, and a stock sale raised $50,000 to be used for preliminary land purchases and the construction of power plants along the route. Once completed, a rail station promised to transform Forsyth's agrarian economy, economy, bringing it once and for all out of the dark days of Reconstruction. The line, which is to be built from Atlanta to Cumming, said the Constitution, will prove one of the greatest developers of a great section. When that time comes, millions of dollars will be added to the taxable values of Georgia and hundreds of thousands of people to North Georgia. Unmentioned in such sunny predictions was the fact that despite its proximity to the state capital, Forsyth was still something of a backwater. It could boast of a handful of wealthy planters and progressive leaders, but was home to a much larger population of poor, illiterate whites who were more worried than excited by talk of rail passengers arriving from Atlanta. Though such a line would bring business opportunities to rich and powerful men in town, it would also put Forsyth in contact with all the competition of the dizzying diversity of the city. To many of the county's weary hill people, such radical change was something to be fended off, not welcome. So that means these redneck people that living in these rural, outskirts places of the cities, which now we refer to them as like suburbans and towns and villages, they wasn't so accepting of this diversity, diversifying, desegregating new world that we had coming. But in the summer of 1912, Charlie Harris had a vision of future in which gleaming locomotives would roll into Cumming Station, bringing wealth, technology, and all the benefits of the new century right into the heart of Forsyth County. As Harris and his partners spread out their crisp maps and pictured the towering bridges and breathtaking tunnels of the Atlanta or Northeastern, it must have seemed like a sure thing. It must have seemed like nothing in the world could stop them. On the same morning that Grant Smith was horsewhipped on the Cummings Square, the black congregations of the county were gathering at the Colored Methodist campground just outside of town, preparing for their annual picnic and barbecue. The event brought together hundreds of parishioners from the African American communities. Many small rural churches, Mount Fair, Shiloh Baptist, Stony Point, Backband Church, and Shakarag Church, were all there. It was traditionally held just as the harvest began in September. It was a time when the poorest in the community could partake in one of the greatest pleasures of farm life. The heaps of roasted corn, black-eyed peas, butter beans, and biscuits, and the whole hogs that had been roasting on spits all night. But this year, as the first families arrived, they learned that 5 young men had been arrested out in Big Creek. Word spread that Morgan and Harriet Strickland's nephew Tony had been accused of rape, and when someone coming from the square reported that whites there were threatening to lynch Grant Smith, many of the crowd could stand by no longer. A group of men who had planned to spend the day tended to the barbecue pits instead started walking towards town, knowing that Reverend Smith was not much safer in the custody of Bill Reed than he had been in the hands of the mob. In 1912, the African American community of Forsyth County was largely made up of illiterate sharecroppers and field hands, but there was a smaller group of educated blacks with close ties to prominent whites, and many of them were leaders of the black churches. Among the crowd at that Saturday picnic were men like Joseph Kellogg, who had helped found the Colored Methodist Campground in 1897 and whose 200-acre farm near Sawney Mountain was the largest black-owned property in the county. Another attendee was Levi Greenlee Jr., whose recently deceased father, Levi Sr., had been the pastor of Shiloh Baptist for many years and left to his children more than 120 acres inside the Cumming city limits. Greenlee was so well liked that in the 1890s, he was invited to join the Hightower Association, a gathering of white clergymen from around North Georgia, and was inducted as the group's first and only black member. In surviving church minutes from Shiloh, we can still hear Reverend Greenlee's voice on a typical Sunday, thanking those in attendance for their donation of $6.36. When Greenlee accepted the collection plates and looked out over the congregation, he saw the benches filled not only with familiar black faces, but also a number of white visitors. Greenlee thanked everyone for their generosity and especially our white friends for their 10 and 25-cent pieces. This means that as Levi Greenlee Jr. and other men from the church picnic walked anxiously towards town, they had reason to hope that, scattered among a sea of enraged faces outside the county courthouse, they might find at least a few sympathetic white allies. At that same moment, hundreds of whites from outlying areas were loading their rifles and shotguns and heading towards Cumming, drawn by a rumor that spread like a wildfire. An army of black men had been spotted leaving the colored campground, people said, infuriated by the attack on Grant Smith. Black rebels, the story went, had filled a wagon with explosives and were planning to dynamite the town without sparing women and children. One witness reported that whites on horsebacks, in buggies and automobiles and afoot steamed into town and loitered about the courthouse as the square became a mecca for armed men, where the protruding coat above the hip told that they were armed for war. For anyone who arrived unprepared, enterprising gun dealers had set up tables on the courthouse lawn and spread out their inventory of rifles, shotguns, pistols, and wooden crates filled with ammunition. So some men that are coming down in hopes of seeing some faces, some white faces that they know, to talk in hopes of freeing this man. It was rumored that these same group black men were called rebels, were supposedly coming down with a wagon full of explosives and was going to dynamite the whole place and not spare any children or women. Wow. That rumor is wild. What? Racism at its best, man. If the tale of Ellen Grice's rape represented one of the most vivid fantasies of Southern whites, this new rumor was fueled by another. The vision of crazed black men rising up and taking vengeance on their former masters. That fear had recently been stoked by reports of a full-scale race war in North Georgia mountains. Only a month before, in July 1912, headlines all over the state had warned that a pitched battle between the races had broken out in the little town of Plainville, 60 miles west of Cumming. The Plainville incident began innocently enough with a black girl and a white boy picking peaches in the same orchard. At some point, the boy, Ivy Miller, was struck by a rock he said was thrown by the girl, Minnie Hurd. But when Hurd's father went to town the next day, hoping to explain the misunderstanding and make peace with the Millers, he was set upon and beaten by whites who warned him never to come back. According to the Macon Telegraph, Minnie Hurd's father stayed away, but her uncle had the audacity to appear in Plainville the following morning as soon as they saw him. Whites accused Hurd's uncle and 3 other black men of forming a plot to burn the town. They were lined up against a wall and whipped until one of the black men saw his chance to escape and took off, firing a pistol over his shoulder. and he and the other men ran, pursued by whites who returned fire. You out here terrorizing people. They feel the need to defend themselves, and then you further terrorizing them because they're defending themselves. This is racist white people are something else, man. Y'all are something else. As the Southern Railway's afternoon train arrived from Chattanooga, first-class passenger glanced out the window. Oh, this is hilarious. First-class passengers glanced out the windows of a dining car and saw one of their oldest and deepest fears sprung to life. A raging gun battle between whites and armed black men. Wow. So a train of some bougie white people seen a gunfight of a man defending himself from some psychos. And their greatest fear just kicked in. Oh my goodness. Hiding in the wounds, wounded and bleeding, the four black men took stock of their situation and quickly came to a desperate conclusion. Having dared to defend themselves against a mob, they now faced the prospect of either being lynched once they were captured or legally hung when they were tried by an all-white jury that was likely to include friends and relatives of the men they had shot. As they peered through the leaves and saw a posse approaching, they decided it was better to be killed in a gunfight than surrender to the kind of white men who regularly tortured, shot, castrated, and burned African Americans alive, often for far less than what these men had already done. That's wild. Jeez. After making it to the cabin of a local black family, the men barricaded themselves inside, took up positions at the windows, and stared out the gathering mob. Some accounts say the gunfight lasted all night, others that it was over in an hour. By the time the smoke cleared, 3 prominent whites had been wounded, including the sheriff of Gordon County. 10 black men and 2 black women were shot, though their names went unrecorded and there is no report as to whether they lived or died. The Macon Telegraph said the battle was maintained until the Negroes ran out of ammunition. Then they were beaten into insensibility by whites who crowded into the cabin, and the lynching was only prevented by officers who pulled their revolvers and stood guard. That's wild. Newspapers as far away as San Francisco and New York portrayed the event not as a case of black men defending themselves against lynchers, but as an ambush of white law officers by a band of Negroes. Sounds about right with New York and California. In September of 1912, the Plainville race war was still fresh in the midst of the white citizens of Forsyth. As they spun the cylinders of Colt revolvers, oiled the bolts of old Winchesters, and thumbed shells into the barrels of shotguns broken over their knees, the lesson must have seemed crystal clear. Whites in Plainville had allowed their own sheriff to be gunned down, and only the brave deeds of a posse had stopped a black insurrection. Wow. Milling around the impromptu gun market that had sprung up outside the courthouse, whites became convinced that they were now the ones in terrible danger. What? Everyone had heard that a black army was rolling down Tolbert Street, trailing behind it a wagon load of dynamite. Lord have mercy. The town of Cumming, whites believed, would soon be under siege, and as the sun climbed high over the square, they prepared to defend it with every weapon they could find. Yo, y'all crazy, racist white peoples are something else. Something motherfucking else. And then niggas be out here asking black people, well, why do y'all feel the same way? And why do you think race is an issue? And why do you not like cops? And why do you not like the... You got random racist niggas being deputized. You got motherfucking KKK members being a part of the motherfucking police. Then you got raggedy states like New York who wants to make it seem like they had nothing to do with slavery, although they had slaves them dang selves. Twisting motherfucking narratives, making it seem like it was a fight between a lawman and some crazy black group, and it was some black men defending themselves from some crazy white people. Because it's mind-blowing. I mean, It even said it in this book that black people were exploited. They strategically chose to provide jobs and give sharecropping positions, no matter how poor the pay was and the treatment, to black people over white people. One, because black people were easily exploited, right? They could not pay black people well. What black people gonna do? Go to court and try to sue? It won't work right for them. So it's easy exploitation. And now you got these crazy white people who's so used to having their lives, you know, they working for their stuff, if they, you know what I'm saying? And stuff starts to change, and then they want to blame the outsider instead of the niggas that's in positions of power. I mean, come on, nigga, you ain't even got no power to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. How the hell you expect us to? And then you got these weirdos who be like, slavery ended mad long ago. Slavery had ended when this was occurring. And look what the freak was happening, bro. Like, you can't just act like slavery just has no motherfucking long enduring effects. Like, do you know what FX definition is with the E, not the A? I mean, come on. It's wild. But hopefully you niggas get educated while you motherfucking listen to me attempt to read this book to y'all. Because like I said, y'all ain't gonna read it on your own. But for those who is willing, Blood at the Root, A Racial Cleansing in America by Patrick Phillips. He's a white man. I'm gonna show you his picture. He's a white man. Because I know there's these crazy people out here that be like, oh, you only like pushing this logic. We'll talk about this later at the end, but stay tuned for the next chapter reading. Peace.